Hey everyone, Clint here from Oak and Iron Outdoors. Today I'm going to go over lighted slip bobbers for walleyes after night, how I utilize slip bobbers in extremely deep water, and also how I set up my slip bobber rigs for walleyes, perch, crappie. And my setups are maybe a little different than most, and I think you're going to be able to pick up some really good tips today after going over this particular video. So let's go over that right now. Well, folks, I love fishing slip bobbers, and they are deadly when it comes to walleyes. I think the issue that a lot of people have, though, is there's a system that is in place, and once you get that system in place when it comes to slip bobbers, that's what makes you a advanced fisherman, if you want to call it that. And I'm not saying that I'm an advanced fisherman or better than anybody else, but, you know, for me, I don't use live scope. I don't even have live scope. And I've had to learn a lot of these techniques from my grandfather and some of the older folks, older guys out there that have been fishing walleyes for years. And then with some of this updated technology, you combine the two and you can create a really great system for getting walleyes in the boat. So without further ado, let's go over the actual setup of my rod. And then I'm going to go through why I use the line I do, why I use the jigs I do, and then how I set up my leaders, bobbers, and the whole shebang. Now let's go over the rod and reel setup. There's nothing fancy at all when it comes to a slip bobber setup. Matter of fact, I would say a cheaper rod that is not essentially super sensitive, because you really don't need sensitivity. Everything is coming, you know, really from the slip bobbers, is giving you the information that you need when to set the hook, obviously. And if you look right here too, you know, this doesn't have a fast action tip. It's more of a mushy fiberglass rod. My other rod setups have inexpensive flugers. You don't need anything fancy. The other thing you have to think of too is that these rod and reels, for the most part, at least for me, are sitting in the bottom of the boat. Or maybe you're a shore fisherman and you're going to be fishing multiple rods. They're going to be on the ground, you know, and I don't want a real fancy, real expensive rod and reel that's always going to be sitting usually in the bottom of the boat or the side of the boat. And I also have my Brittany Spaniel Lily with me. And Lily's known to step on a few rods and reels. So once again, I don't want a real high-end reel, pun intended. The one thing I want to talk about is the main line that is on your reel. Now, you're going to hear different stories, concepts, whatever it might be in regards to line. For my purpose, and I've tried different lines, braided line, even for slip bobbers, so on and so forth, but it's to utilize just good old-fashioned monofilament line. And the reason being is that monofilament line is more neutral, meaning that it doesn't technically really float, but it doesn't sink either. It's more neutral based. It's also inexpensive, but I don't want that line to sink. And that is very, very important. If you use a braided line, that braided line is going to sink. And what it's going to do is it's going to take that slip bobber, okay, and it's going to pull that slip bobber over just a little bit, just due to the weight of the line. This guy is the indicator for everything. It's telling me if I'm bumping into rocks, weeds, the top of the weeds, the main part of the weeds, wherever it is, this is the main indicator. And I don't want a line pulling this over a little bit, giving me false indications or taking away from the ability to indicate whether I'm in weeds or whatever it might be. So I want a neutral, buoyant line, and that is why I utilize regular monoline. And the line I like the best is just the Trilene, the Berkley Trilene Smooth Casting XL. And I utilize 8-pound test. I've utilized 10 or 12 in the past, but that 8-pound test just allows me to cast a little bit further without having to put too much oomph into the cast. And you're just making gentle, easy cast with this particular line. You know, guys, I really enjoy making these videos for you guys, and I'll make these videos no matter what. But it really helps me out when I see people subscribe to these particular videos. And that tells me, this is the stuff that people really like, and I'm going to make these videos no matter what. I'll just make more of them, and maybe getting into a little bit more greater detail when I see people subscribe. So if you don't mind, please hit that subscribe button, and that tells me that you really like these styles of videos. Now, when it comes to the business end of the line, I'm going to touch on the actual slip bobbers here shortly. But from the slip bobber down to the end with whether you use a jig or you use a hook, here I have a little glass bead with tinsel hook on it. So I don't know if you can see, but I have a glass bead. This is a chartreuse glass bead with a purple tinsel on it. And this particular line that runs from the slip bobber to your business end, for me, is always fluorocarbon. And I fish a lot of clear waters, and even in dirtier waters too. I still think this does make a little bit of a difference. Not as much, but I just get into that habit of always using fluorocarbon leaders. Now, some people will ask, Clint, why don't you just use fluorocarbon for the entire rod reel setup? Well, first of all, it's much more expensive. And second, fluorocarbon is very stiff and it sinks as well. So once again, it's going to tip this bobber over right away and it coils like a bugger. So, you know, when I very first started with fluorocarbon, I did, you know, put fluorocarbon on a complete reel many, many years ago, and it caused nothing but problems, tangles, whatever it might be. And I use fluorocarbon almost on every rod and reel setup for walleye, perch, crappie, but it's only utilized for leaders. Now, the particular fluorocarbon that I like and I have tried a lot, and I'm going to tell you right now, not all fluorocarbon is created equal. First of all, I'm not sponsored by any of these companies that I'm showing you the products that I'm utilizing today, but Seagar, the yellow labeled Seagar here in the 8-pound test, is the primary fluorocarbon I utilize for almost all of my walleye setups. Now, for my crappie and perch setups, I use 4-pound test fluorocarbon, but I utilize the 8-pound test fluorocarbon for all of my slip bobber setups. I know some people will say 10 or 12. Try to go with as light as possible. I think people get a little bit of a false indication in their mind thinking that, well, if it's fluorocarbon, it's invisible to fish. And it's partially true. But believe it or not, especially if you fish some of those really super clear waters, 12-pound test fluorocarbon will not put as many fish in the boat as, say, 8-pound test fluorocarbon. So if you can help it, depending upon the fish you're going after, utilize the lightest fluorocarbon you can get away with. Now, hopefully you can see this, but I happen to have a barrel swivel right here. This particular barrel swivel will go from my leader, which is down here, to the business end, and then obviously up to the slip bobber. Now you do want a little bit bigger ball bearing swivel, because if you look in the bottom of this bobber, this can actually go into the bobber and stick to it if it's too small. So I like a little bit bigger ball bearing swivel for that purpose. The other thing is, some people will think uni knot or maybe a blood knot to it, and you want a ball bearing swivel because your bait, especially minnows and even leeches to an extent, they twirl and spin, and then if they're going through current, they'll spin. If they're going through weeds, they'll spin, and that will create a lot of twist in your line. And over time, even with using a ball bearing swivel, you'll get a ton of twist into your fishing line, and that can create for some major issues, especially when it comes to casting, reading the bobber, so on and so forth. So you do want that ball bearing swivel, and I like to put that ball bearing swivel roughly about, on this rod, it's probably about 3 feet, not the longest, but I'll make it as far as I can all the way to the tip of the rod in some cases. And you don't want it to be further than that, because you want the bobber then to be able to rest in front. Because if you put this too far, it gives no space for the bobber to rest on the rod. You know, so 4 feet to me is ideal. Now, one thing I want to mention when it comes to the ball bearing here, you want to be specific on the knots you utilize, and there's a reason why. So when I tie the main line that has a slip bobber on it, I utilize a Palomar knot from there to here. The Palomar knot is extremely strong. Now, once you get this line here, the business end line, the fluorocarbon leader, you are unable to tie a Palomar knot on this direction. You can only tie a Palomar knot one of 2 directions. So Palomar knot will go top first, and then I utilize just simply 7 to 8 of a cinch knot, or the good old-fashioned fish knot. Now, the reason I do that is if I ever snag up, which I snag up quite a bit, especially if I'm fishing the systems in wood or heavy rock boulder, when they snap or they pop and I can't get them out of the snag, you're only going to lose the weakest end, which will be down here, the lower end of the ball bearing swivel, because you're using that cinch knot, not the Palomar knot. The Palomar knot stronger up here. So what I'm only losing is I'm only going to lose this business end that has essentially the line, the fluorocarbon leader, the split shot, and then whatever bait I'm utilizing. If I had this in reverse, what will end up happening is this will break up here on the ball bearing swivel, and then the bobber will sometimes come off, and then I have to go track down my bobbers. Then this part comes off the bead. So long story short, I don't want to be going out having to chase a bobber around the lake, especially if I want a hot bite somewhere. So I want the break to happen down here. So that's the reason you want Palomar knot up top and that 7 to 8 twist cinch knot down below. So that way if it breaks, you only lose that bottom end. The next important tip is the split shot. So if you take a look here, I have 2 split shot, and I always run with either 2 or 3 split shot on your fluorocarbon leader. Now, what ends up happening is if you just put 1 split shot, or let's just say I take both of these split shot, okay, and I bring them together, it creates a fulcrum in the middle of the fluorocarbon leader. And what ends up happening is that when you cast, this line will literally wrap around because you have 1 fulcrum, and it creates almost like a V component, and it likes to wrap around itself, creating a lot of mid-cast tangles. So by taking the split shot and spreading them out, when you make that cast, it makes more of a balanced cast, and it doesn't wrap around itself. The other thing with split shot that I want to mention is if you notice, mine run just a little loose. And what that actually does, it creates an anti-snag mechanism, if you want to call it that. Now, any of you who fish slip bobbers long enough, you know that if you can get these to come down to the business end, this will pop it free. So a lot of times when I'm going to snag in wood or in boulders, rocks, and I keep snapping it back and forth, a lot of times this lead will actually come down and it'll snap it free. So in some ways, it acts as a anti-snag component, and you get your whole system, your whole rig back. You just might have the hook bent over, and you just bend the hook back. So always keep that in mind. You really don't ever want to take pliers and lock these split shot down tight, because if you do, they won't slide down, and they won't be able to get your jig head out or hook out, or whatever you're snagged into. But you also want to make sure that they're tight enough that they're not constantly sliding down from on the jig. Bobbers. What is the best bobber to utilize? I'm going to be honest with you, and once again, I have no affiliation with any of these companies, but I really like the Lucky Jack bobbers. These particular bobbers seem to be more popular in bait shops years ago. They still do make them. They seem to be harder to find, but you can find them out there. But the reason I like these particular bobbers is because they have a more narrow profile than some of the other slip bobbers that are out there. And what that does is it allows it to be able to be read more. And what I mean by read more is that when it's going through the water, I want it to go through the water just like I have it, straight up and down. So anytime I start to tick rocks or I start to tick weeds, it'll create that little bit of tip over. And that's telling me that, you know, right where my bait is at and what's going on down there. And then if I'm dealing with little perch or maybe small bluegills, you know, I can see that little bit of that tip, 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 or tick, tick, tick. And that's the reason why I do like, or one of the reasons why I like this particular bobber. Now, the main reason though, the main reason I like this bobber is the lighted feature. So these bobbers, the green and the red here, have particular lights that are you put in here. They have a rubber seal that keeps the water out, and I'm going to unscrew one right now. And these are essentially those little lights that you get like for your arrows if you are a bow hunter, and you'll put in a lighted knock. You can get these in higher quantities if you especially go to Amazon, and that's what I do. I buy these extra, and then these guys you just simply put into a hole. So you got the main hole for the bobber here, so you can see there's like a straw component, and that's where the line will actually go through once this is put together. And then you just take this, you can put it on either side, and then what I like to do is I like to leave this lighted component right in the bobber. I don't ever take it out. And then when I'm not utilizing it at night, I can just simply take this light, you pull back on the light, and it turns it off. So you can utilize this bobber with the light in it 24/7, and then when it gets close to dark, just simply uncap it, push the light down, You can screw this cap on with the line on. Not a big deal at all. So you don't have to take the bobber off your line. And boom, there you go. Now, the one thing I do want to mention is I have different colored lights. I have a red light and I have a green light. So the purpose of that is when I'm fishing at night, if you have all red lights, here in Wisconsin we can use 3 lines. If I throw out 3 lines and I see a red bobber go down, I can pick up 2 rods, and usually my luck, I pick up the 2 rods that don't have the fish on it, and then all of a sudden you have the 3rd one. If you have different colored bobbers out there, you can tell right away that, you know, this line goes to that bobber, and this particular rod reel line goes to that bobber. Now, when rigging your bobber on here, you put the little stopper on here, and I found out the best stoppers for me. I've tried some of the other different stoppers, but just a good old-fashioned yarn pre-made stopper that you can purchase, and then utilizing that colored bead. Now, if you look closely, you're going to see that I don't have 1, but 2 stoppers on here. And there's a reason for that. I'll talk about that in just a bit. Now, the stoppers I utilize are these colored stoppers here. They come with a little bead in them. You can usually buy a pack of them. Sometimes when you buy the slip bobber, they will actually come directly with the slip bobber. And then you just run that line through that little tube, pull the tube away. It has usually a slit on it. If not the slit, you could just pull that all the way back, and then you just pull the 2 ends tight. Now, one of the mistakes I'll see with friends who are fishing slip bobbers is they will either leave the end tags too long, which when it goes through the eyes of your rod, it'll slow the line down, sometimes actually tangle, get caught in it. It'll actually stop it immediately, and all of a sudden you see the bait going flying off into the water. The other issue is they cut the tags too short. Now, what ends up happening sometimes is the stopper will get too loose, and if it gets too loose, you're going to want to be able to pull that tight. So I always make sure I leave just enough line on my stopper that I can just pinch my fingers and pull it. And I want to leave just enough, because once again, if I leave it too long, it's going to start catching up in the eyes here, slowing the cast down, and then sometimes creating tangles. Deep water walleyes using slip bobbers. As far as I know, I think I'm the only person I've ever seen go after walleyes in 30 to 35 feet of water utilizing slip bobbers. Most people will usually troll for them, but slip bobbers can be extremely dangerous because a lot of times when those walleyes are slipping off into that deep water, they're not very aggressive or active to begin with. And I've literally caught walleyes left and right in front of people who've been trolling right in front of me. And I feel it's because of the slip bobber just keeping that bait right there, right in front of their face, tantalizing them until they grab it. Where when you're trolling, that bait just goes by, boom, and it's gone, it's out the window. And if they're not really aggressive, they're not going to put the energy to go grab it. Now, that's the purpose of the 2 tags that I have right here. The first tag, for instance, is the shallow water tag, I like to call it, or shallow water stopper. And the shallow stopper is where I go usually early morning. So that can be 8 to 12 feet, usually on a weed edge somewhere, or just trying to keep that bait just above the weeds. And then when I move out later in the day, or let's say mid-morning, I'll utilize this deep stopper. And what I end up doing is taking the shallow stopper, you're just going to move that shallow stopper all the way till it meets the deep stopper. And then your slip bar will be able to come all the way up. And then let's say I want to set it at 31 feet. I will then utilize the depth finder. I'll show you what that is shortly. Set it at that 31 feet. And then once I'm done for mid-morning, and then I want to come back later in the evening, I can leave that deep stopper there. And then I can take this shallow stopper and I can easily move it back to that 10, 12 feet of water. Or if I want to bounce back out, I know exactly that this is set at, let's say, 31 feet or whatever depth that I set it at earlier. And it allows me to easily go back and forth between the two, because if I only use one of the stoppers, then I have to constantly go all the way back, sometimes, 20, 25 feet, whatever it might be. Now, when it comes to deep water walleyes, that's why I like the larger bobber. It's not that the fish are any bigger in deep water compared to, let's say, if I'm fishing them in 8 feet of water. As a matter of fact, northern Wisconsin, most of the fish that I'm after are in that 15 to 20 inch size category compared to, let's say, if I'm fishing the Bay of Green Bay. But with that being said, what I am allowed to do now is I can put more split shot on here to get it down there faster, because I don't want to put split shot, like little split shot on a bobber, have it too heavy and bring my light bobber down too quickly. Okay. I want this heavier one to put more split shot on it, and then it gets down there faster, gets in the zone faster while it completes that swim through. And that's one of the key components, is not just to throw a bobber out, especially at the back end of the boat, and let it just sit there in one spot, unless you know that the fish are located exactly in that particular area. A lot of times when I'm fishing deeper water too, the fish can be spread out a little bit, and I want that line to get down there as fast as possible. Once again, more split shot means bigger bobber. And if I switch this back to shallower water, not a big deal. Once again, if they're willing to spit it in deep water, they'll spit it in shallow water, but most cases they hold on to that bait no matter what. And once again, that more narrow profile makes them easier to pull down, but because of the length of it, creating the buoyancy through the long end, they don't feel it as much. Now let's talk about the business end. My go-to hook, for the most part, is these Gamakatsu octopus hooks. These particular hooks are extremely sharp, one of the reasons I like them so much. And then the other key is that chartreuse component. That does seem to play a pretty important role, at least the lakes that I fish, on clear lakes, clear water lakes. I tend to find that if they get too gaudy, meaning the jig heads are too big, or there's too many beads or whatever it might be on them, that they kind of don't take them as much. But just that little bit of chartreuse, it seems to be just enough to get them to bite. Now, another favorite of mine is utilizing these little tinsel jigs. They essentially have a little bit of a glass bead on it. This is in chartreuse. And then once again, that purple end to it. And then having a gold to sometimes a silver hook. I think this one has a gold hook, actually. But this little guy right here is just enough, and it acts kind of as a fly. So during a mayfly hatch, or when you're getting close to the mayfly hatch, when, as you know, walleyes can be shut mouth, these little guys seem to come in very handy compared to just the good old-fashioned hook. They just happen to represent, I think, a little bit of a fly per se. And then the other thing I like to do during the mayfly hatch, and another little quick tip, is to wacky rig a crawler. You take a night crawler, you just cut it in about a third, keep it fairly small because their diet, they're loaded up on mayflies. Let it hang like a wacky rig style. And I'll even put that on here. Put it in a wacky rig, and then that for some reason looks a little bit more like a mayfly because you have the wings hanging off, and it's essentially just a crawler. So add that little tip if you're fishing walleyes during that mayfly hatch. But this little guy here is a go-to as well. Now, if you're going to utilize a jig, I keep them extremely small. This is a 1/32 ounce Northland tackle. This is a new color they came out with, I believe, last year, and I really like it. It's like an anti-freeze color. Now, I will utilize these particular small jigs when I'm fishing more stained water, just to give it that little extra something to pop out. The other thing too is if you rig your jig up, kind of like if you're ice fishing, I will rig it up so that way the line is holding like such. So that way when it goes through the water, okay, the head is actually going straight through, and that pulls them through the weeds a little bit easier than if you hang it down like this going through the water. So it's no different than ice fishing. If you're big into ice fishing, you know that you want that jig to be as horizontal as possible, and that does make a big difference. Now, when you're fishing weeds, I will really downsize these hooks. Now, even these hooks are a little bit bigger, and I don't have my really small hooks with me right now, but I will put on size 14 or size 16 hooks. You don't need a very big hook to actually catch a walleye. But what that does is allows that bait to go through weeds and not get weeds or weed material tangled up on those particular hooks. Now, one of the most deadly combinations out there is putting these weedless, or essentially woodless, I like to call them, jigs on the slip bobber setup. This is a fairly small jig head here with the weed guard on it, or essentially I like to call it wood guard. And I will throw these right into the wood. So usually what I like to look for on a lot of my favorite walleye lakes in northern Wisconsin is a big old pine tree, cedar tree, falling in the water, close to deep water, and then go in just directly tied to a line and then jig it through. But why not double your opportunities if you can use a second line? So I will hook another one of these actually on my slip bobber rig. Once again, you want it to be as horizontal as possible. You don't want to be having it hang downward. more likely to get caught. Okay. And then that bullet head on here will guide that jig head right through the wood, and it might bounce off a little bit. But if you have a good guard, like this particular jig does, you won't get caught up. Now, you will sometimes get caught up here and there, but that weed guard or wood guard really keeps that from happening a lot. And I catch a lot of walleyes just running this weedless jig head under a slip bobber system. And then I'll be casting with the other one. And usually those 2 lines are just enough. Once again, 3 lines here in Wisconsin. Those 2 lines will be plenty to keep me busy or work a piece of wood over. And I can work it a little bit faster that way. And I can pick off whatever walleyes are there. And it's just that speed component. The more down trees, underwater wood that I can work, the more walleyes I catch during a day. So, your depth finder. So simply put, this is a depth finder here. It's got the clamp on top, and that just hooks onto your business end. You place it on here, and then you're just going to drop that system down. And how you measure how far you want to be off the bottom will be dependent upon how far the bobber goes under the water when you put that depth finder on. So if the bobber goes under 1 foot, so I usually just measure, I reel down to the top of the water, I'll pull it up, I'll see that from the bobber to the tip of my rod is 1 foot. Then once I take the depth finder off, put my bait on, cast it out there, I'll be 1 foot off the bottom. And then same with 2 feet, 3 feet, however far you want to be off the bottom. Now, in most cases, I like to be fairly close to the fish. Obviously, you have to give them some room to be able to pull it down. And I like to be in that range between 18 inches and essentially 24 inches. I do find, though, that when fish are extremely lethargic, you like to be fairly close to the bottom. And then what ends up happening, and this is why you want a good bobber that you can be able to read this, is that all of a sudden you're going to notice that bobber start to go in opposite direction, but not necessarily down, or it'll kind of go down just a little bit and start to go off the side, but not necessarily down under the water. And that's one of the key components about reading these particular bobbers, which we're going to talk about next. You know, walleyes are kind of a funny bunch. They're no different than humans. A lot of people, when they get a walleye on, the first thing they do, they set the hook, they reel it in, they pull it up, and they throw it back out there again, right in that same spot where they caught the lost walleye. I don't blame them. But one of the things that you really should do is that when you get a fish on, watch what your bobber does, or essentially watch what the walleye does. The walleyes will always pull that bobber, for most cases, away from the rest of the walleye family that's down there. So if you are in a particular spot and you start to see that bobber go deeper water, then you know that those fish are going to be a little bit more shallow for whatever reason, and maybe there's, you know, that wood pile or the weed point, whatever it might be, and then vice versa. If you start to see that go in shallower, you know then those walleyes are a little bit deeper. So sometimes use that first fish, or maybe even a second or third fish, to find out where those walleyes actually are in relation to the other fish, because when they pull bait away, they're actually pulling the bait away from the other fish that are in that particular area. Now, I'm a little old-fashioned and a little frugal as well. I don't have live scope, so I utilize, still to this day, my slip bobbers and my jigs to tell me what's under the water, as well as, you know, my regular fish finder. I do have a Garmin fish finder, or multiple Garmin fish finders on my boat, and I have side imaging, so I utilize those as well. But what I am doing, though, is when I cast these guys out, I am watching how they react to everything that's underneath. And, you know, when these get pulled through, I might see this bobber go straight, and all of a sudden it tips, and it might do this, let's say, for 10 yards, and it goes back up again. And it's telling me that's where that little weed pocket is, that little weed point. And then I'll take my jig along with my rod, my sensitive, we'll call it my high-end rod that I use for jig casting, and I'll cast right into those particular spots. Same with wood. A lot of times I know that there's underwater wood in a particular area. I don't know exactly where that big log is or that bigger brush pile is, and I'll maybe throw on that weedless jig on under the slip bobber. I will let that go through. Boom, it kind of tells me a little bit by bouncing around, hitting that brush pile, and then going back again. And then that tells me exactly where to cast with that jigging rod and then that weedless or woodless jig. And that's what I mean by a system. And that's how I utilize all of these together. So sometimes this is just to tell me where everything is and what fish are doing. And then I utilize that good old pick them apart, almost like a sniper, you know, utilizing that jig rod. So what are some of the biggest mistakes that I see of people utilizing slip bobbers? The biggest mistake I see is when people do not reel up that slack line and they set that line when that bobber goes down and there's too much slack line. I don't know why a lot of people do that, but if you're fishing the way I do, where you cast it out and you let the wind bring it down, it's kind of easy for that big loop to get into your line. And then a lot of people don't realize that you can actually reel that right up. And matter of fact, a lot of times I can actually feel the fish on the other end of the line, and I got to be a little careful with that because you can lose them. But I just gotten to the point where I'll reel it up, I'll feel that little bit of weight, and they won't spit it. But as soon as I feel that weight, I'm setting that hook right away, and that just gives a nice easy hook set. The other thing I see people do is they jerk the rod. It's almost like a jerk motion, and you just want a nice easy set. And once again, that's the purpose of that mushy longer rod. And I think another mistake is that, you know, they look at slip bobbers as the one all fix all, and you really should be utilizing it with another rod or rigged setup. Whether you're casting crankbaits or whether you're casting like I do jigs along with it, and when those two work together, they almost talk to each other when you think about it, and that's what really puts you on more walleyes, because one can give you information that the other may or may not. And maybe, you know, you're feeling that one big log underneath, or you're picking fish out of that particular spot. And you know what's kind of interesting is there's times literally where those fish will not take a slow moving jig on the bottom when you're pulling it across, but yet they'll take that slip bobber every single time, and then vice versa. So summer's upon us. I plan on hitting up the Northwoods Lakes in northern Wisconsin and doing some camping trips up there, chasing walleyes, perch, crappie, smallmouth bass, and doing some muskie fishing later this summer. And then I'll be doing some bow hunting videos probably towards the end of August into September as well. So a good reason to follow Oak and Iron Outdoors. So folks, right now, I got to get all this stuff put away. I'm heading out to Lake Winnebago tomorrow, do some walleye fishing out there, utilizing slip bobbers. And if I get some good footage and some nice walleyes in the boat, I'll be putting that out on the channel as well. So until next time, Clint from Oak and Iron Outdoors.